Okay, good morning and welcome to the 10th installment of Honors College Forum Pandemic. I'm super excited today to have the entire, it seems like, supply chain management crew from the Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas, who've been having a great time already, clearly a collegial crowd, and some pranksters in there as well. And this team is going to talk in rotation on different aspects of the story of supply chain, which we've all been hearing about constantly and how important it is, in the context of this pandemic, with maybe some thoughts about moving forward. And it's an incredibly gifted and renowned team of scholars publishing in the Harvard Business Review very recently. In fact, more publications to come. Leadings internationally, I would say, in the study of supply chain and blockchain. And the head honcho, Dean Matt Waller of the Walton College of Business, my decanal colleague, is here. And he's also joined by Associate Dean Brent Williams. And we have the chair of the supply chain management crew, Brian Fugate, as well. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the order and title of the presentations, and then I'm going to turn it over to the first presenter. So first, answering the great question, what is supply chain management, will be Professor Rod Thomas. Thomas will be followed by his colleague, David Dabrowski, who is going to talk about hospital supply chains. John Kent then will take it up and talk about temporary supply chains. And Mary Lassity, who is the director of the Blockchain Center of Excellence and a professor of information systems, along with her colleague Remco van Hoyk, who's a professor of supply chain management, will be talking about risk management and blockchain. Brian Fugate will talk about food supply chains, and he's the Orrin Harris Chair in Transportation and Chair of the Department, as I mentioned, of Supply Chain Management. The penultimate speaker will be Brent Williams, using Agile to lead and manage during the pandemic. And then the final speaker is my decanal colleague, the awesome and epic Matt Waller, Dean of the Walton College of Business. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and I'm going to turn it over to our renowned colleagues who are going to give us a very different angle than we've been receiving thus far on the story of pandemic. So take it away, Dr. Thomas.
I'm going to go right now just to give a quick prologue. Thank you, Dean Kuhn, for somehow that says, yeah, don't click stop presenting, because the next person can just take it over, which I'll do here.
I'm going ahead and putting that back up.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to recognize Dean Kuhn. I believe the University of Arkansas was the first university to announce a course on the pandemic. And this is the second to the last of the courses. And Dean Kuhn is very creative. Thank you, Dean Kuhn, for putting this together. And Dr. Hancock, who is also involved in creating this course. Dr. Hancock, before she got her PhD in history, some of you probably don't know this, but she was in logistics and supply chain at a consumer packaged goods company. So she's got significant experience there. Thank you, Dean Kuhn and Dr. Hancock, for letting us present. Compared to the other courses that we've had in this pandemic forum, this one, as Dean Kuhn said, will have many different presenters. But I wanted to give you access to a couple of resources that might be of help. One, we have a blog site on the Walton College website called Walton Insights. That's at walton.uark.edu/insights. And I bring it up, there's short blogs on there about all kinds of business topics, but in the pandemic, of course, we keep having more and more pandemic related articles pop up. So if you find this interesting, you're welcome to keep reading and keep up to date with Walton Insights. For those of you who are rising seniors going into your senior year, one thing you might want to consider is we have a Master's of Science in Supply Chain Management at our website. And all undergraduate majors are welcome. You can go full-time or you can go part-time. You can go at your own pace. But there are great careers there. You might want to take a look at that website. It's walton.uark.edu/graduate programs/supply chain master's degree. The words are separated by dashes, just like it is on the screen. And we also do have an undergraduate program and a PhD program. And for our undergraduate program, we've got both the traditional face-to-face courses, and we also have an online program. So at any rate, without further ado, let's get into this great topic. And we will have Rod Thomas. Rod, I'm giving this to you. Rod is going to be talking about the question, what is supply chain management? Thank you, Rod.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm trying to get the slides to move here.
Here, I can do it for you.
Okay.
I'll just go to the next slide.
All I'm seeing is the title slide, Matt. Has it moved elsewhere?
It has. It's on to the next slide.
Hey, Matt, I don't think you took control, maybe. Or do you have it now? Yeah, because it still shows Dr. Thomas.
There you go.
There you go.
Okay. Okay. Go back up one for me, Matt, please.
Okay.
All right. Well, good morning. I'm excited to talk with you today and spend a few minutes discussing supply chains and supply chain management. I know a lot of you have probably heard those terms quite a bit in the media recently. You're starting to realize how important they are, but I could also understand how you might be a little fuzzy on what those terms still mean. So Dean Waller asked me to spend a few minutes just conceptualizing this with you and walking you through. So go ahead to the next slide, please, Matt. Supply chains have been around for thousands of years. I like to tell my students it's the original business discipline, and I say that for the following reason. Our ancestors, back when we were literally Neanderthals, in order to survive, relied on woolly mammoths, often for food, clothing, and shelter. And think about the activities involved in making that happen. There were probably some scouts that had to leave camp to go out to locate the animals, and then they come back together and figure out which option was best for a good hunt. In supply chain terms, we would call those the first sourcing professionals. They identified raw materials that we needed, they went out and found sources of it, and they made a supplier selection decision. At that point, the hunters would go out, take down the animal, field dress it, process the carcass, start breaking it down into meat for food, and taking the hides and the furs for clothing and shelter. Well, I would refer to those people as the first operations experts. Operations is all about taking inputs and transforming them into outputs, or taking raw materials and processing those, adding value to it, and make it into the goods we need. At that point, you have this meat that we need to eat, but it's probably not located near the village. So the logistics experts would come in, they'd pack it up, they'd move it, they'd store it, they'd transport it, and they'd get it to the ultimate end users. Those three core functions form a rudimentary supply chain. Those three activities, if we didn't perform all of them and they didn't work together, our ancestors would have starved. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Matt. Well, in modern supply chains, we still start with sourcing, logistics, and operations. And those functions have to be highly integrated within our firm. But we realized over the years that there's tremendous value in integrating with those functions with functions in other firms. So we work closely with our suppliers and our suppliers and our customers and our customers' customers. Supply chains refer to all the organizations, all those firms that are linked together by that movement or flow of products and information about the products and the money associated with the products. And it encompasses everything from the raw materials, that point of origin, moving all the way through the supply chain to the end consumers, that end point of consumption. We tend to conceptualize those things as chains. In reality, they're networks. Think of massive spider webs that cover the globe and overlap with one another. But that chain of activities, if everything doesn't go, if one link in that chain fails, the overall supply chain fails because we don't get food, if you will, to our end consumers. Will you go to the next slide, please, Matt? So why do these things exist? We've had them since the beginning of time, but they exist to serve customers. Supply chains exist to get the right products to the right place at the right time. Those pictures up there are showing you we have supply chain issues right now. We're not getting food in some instances. We're not getting hygiene products or medical supplies. So that's a supply chain issue that we need managers to go work on. Matt, will you go forward one for me, please? So if that was what a supply chain was, what does supply chain management refer to? It's really all about making that supply chain operate better. And when I say better, it's how do we meet those customer needs in a more efficient, effective, and sustainable manner? How do we get products to where customers need them while using less resources? Or how do we improve service to those customers? And how do we do it in a long-term sustainable manner so supply chains can continue to operate in the future? At the end of the day, customers always want better, cheaper, and faster products. We got to figure out ways from a management perspective of how to get those supply chains to deliver on that. If you go one more. So how do you do that? That's the $1 million question, $1 billion question, $1 trillion question. People spend their entire careers trying to figure that out in industry. We spend our entire career studying it. I can tell you at a high level, it involves a lot of communication, collaboration, and coordination. In order to get that cross-functional integration, to work with different organizations all around the globe, you got to develop close relationships. And we do that because we know if we work as a team, those cross-functional processes will work better. In terms of data, long before data science and big data became all in vogue, supply chains have been looking at massive amounts of data for decades. We are constantly looking at data on supply and demand and trying to balance those and get what needs to be where it needs to be. We also, when we're managing supply chains, need to take a very broad systems view. We can't look at just any one piece. We got to look at the overall system and synchronize those activities within that entire system, again, to get the products where they need to be for consumers. If we do this well, if we manage our supply chains to the best of our abilities, it will improve the quality of our life. It will improve society. The reason you're hearing so much about supply chains right now is there's some failures going on there. There's some stress points, and we're starting to feel it. But when we do it right, you don't even notice us, okay? Unless you're in business. And in business, if you do it right, if you manage your supply chains better than your competition, that's a sustainable competitive advantage. That will differentiate you from your rivals, and you'll have all kinds of financial performance benefits that go with that. So I hope that helps. I know we're going to get into a lot of detail about healthcare supply chains, but I just wanted to give you a conceptual overview and turn it over to David.
Well, thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm David Dobrikowski. It's great to have this opportunity. Thanks, Dean Waller, to talk about healthcare supply chains. It's a great morning to spend with my esteemed colleagues here today. So Dr. Thomas gave just a great introduction to what supply chains are, right? He used words like balance. He used words like synchronize. And that's really fundamentally what supply chain is about, synchronizing or balancing supply and demand. And if you think about this from a healthcare perspective now, at the bottom of the screen, the kind of orangish circle shows the product-oriented aspect of the supply chain, or what we call the upstream portion of the supply chain, that woolly mammoth that Dr. Thomas talked about. In healthcare, these are items like medical devices, say hip replacements, In pharmaceuticals, they're medications. In the context of COVID-19, a product that's gotten a lot of attention, of course, is personal protective equipment, or PPE. These products are ultimately used in the green circle in the supply chain, which is what we call the downstream or demand oriented tiers or echelons in the supply chain. These are places where you go to access care, like your physician's office or Washington Regional Medical Center, a hospital, pharmacies, clinics, and so forth. The truth is, in all supply chains, the products or materials are linked to the customers, where the green circle is, through some sort of channel captain, we call them. And these channel captains are organizations that work to do what Dr. Thomas talked about, synchronize or organize the supply chain. They tend to be the ones that have the ability to create financial coordination. In other words, they're receiving payments from customers and they're also paying suppliers and so forth. So if you think about it, right here in Northwest Arkansas and around the world, we have the Fortune 1 company in the retail supply chain, Walmart. They're clearly the channel captain. You drive down the road, you see a Walmart truck, you can visit a Walmart distribution center, as well as a store. They largely manage or tightly control their supply chain. But the channel captain's not always the retailer. Where I come from, about an hour south of Detroit, in the automotive supply chain, think about Fiat Chrysler for a moment. Fiat Chrysler is the channel captain of their automotive supply chain. Dr. Thomas talked about suppliers. Well, Fiat Chrysler actually pays their supplier's supplier to deliver products to their closest supplier. So they clearly kind of are the channel captain or control that automotive supply chain. In healthcare, the supply chain channel captain you could think of as this center tier, if you will. The medical surgical distributors, suppliers, do some light manufacturing. These are folks like Owens & Minor, AmerisourceBergen, Henry Schein, Concordance, and others that ultimately serve as that linchpin to attempt to try to balance the products that are used in healthcare with the points of distribution. So how did this come to be? Well, I'm glad you asked, right? So if you think about Walmart again, they have a little over 5,300 stores in the United States and a very complicated supply chain to manage. From a healthcare perspective, though, there are over 200,000 points of distribution. If you consider the roughly 6,000 hospitals, all of the pharmacies, outpatient clinics, ancillary providers like labs and radiology providers and so forth, that have to be somehow linked to just over 2,000 manufacturers that provide those products. So if each hospital endeavored to try to be the channel captain and control their own supply chain, it would lead to a lot of redundancy, a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of both cost and work redundancies. And because of this, we've seen this distribution model kind of emerge in the healthcare supply chain, where distributors, those med-surg distributors, tend to be the focal point, along with group purchasing organizations, to coordinate all this activity. Well, what is all this activity, right? Well, this activity includes work like sourcing that Dr. Thomas talked about. It includes work like operations. Believe it or not, these medical surgical suppliers will actually take large cases of product, decompose them, and reconstruct them into kits and totes that are specifically provided to hospitals with labels that include what is called the PAR location, a specific storeroom, let's say on the 4th floor is where this tote belongs. So they're very intimately involved in managing a hospital's supply chain. And as a result of this, today, over 50% of hospital spend is managed through this distribution network. 50% may not sound like a lot, initially, until you consider all the expenses that a hospital has, like cafeteria, dietary, parking lots, general maintenance, all of these types of expenditures that are important to run a hospital, but don't necessarily run through the distribution network. 90% of pharmacy spend, of course, goes through this distribution network. So what's happened essentially is that hospitals have relied very heavily on medical surgical suppliers and distributors. And while this is an overgeneralization, they've essentially outsourced the supply chain function until very recently. A few examples have emerged where they're trying to bring this kind of more in-house and create a core competency around it. But keep that thought for a moment as we talk about what has happened with COVID from a supply chain disruption perspective. So when we think about, when we plan for supply chain disruptions, we generally think about two fundamental dimensions. One would be the probability. What's the likelihood that this disruption could happen? And then on the x-axis, of course, what are the consequences? How bad could this possibly be? And then we plan accordingly, to mitigate those types of risks. So if we think about, and I hate to use the term common, but more common disasters, at least those disasters that don't happen every 100 years, you might think about a plant fire. A plant fire would take out a single supplier, and it could be a substantial risk to the supply chain. But generally, in a reasonable amount of time, you're able to shift supply to other suppliers or to unaffected regions. Another example of a disruption might be an earthquake or a hurricane or wildfires out west. Those, again, are terrible disruptions to the supply chain. But again, they tend to be more episodic. In other words, they have a very clear beginning and end, and you can kind of shift, sources of supply to meet demand, geographically speaking. When we think about COVID in this model, it started with Wuhan, China, of course, and ultimately a single plant closure, which led to a transportation disruption, ultimately multiple port closures. We started to see labor unrest. You probably recall Amazon had positive employee COVID tests, and employees were, reluctant to come to work. So it led to some labor unrest. We had some visible quality problems. You might have heard of, again, rare, but anecdotally, we've heard of shipments of masks being opened and healthcare providers finding Halloween costumes in them, right? So we've had some visible quality problems. And then ultimately where we are today with this economic recession. So when we think about COVID, I think it's important to think about the fact that COVID is off the charts, okay? This is a disruption like we haven't seen before, and we haven't even thought about the demand side increase that we've realized, where I saw that Lauren had asked a question about a 17x increase in PPE, where we've actually seen demand increase for personal protective equipment 17-fold. Supply chains generally are just not equipped to manage that kind of increase in demand, and we think about a 50% increase or even a twofold increase. That's a lot to manage. 17x is really a difficult, environment to manage, which is why one of the several methods that you've seen applied in the last few months to try to balance supply and demand have really centered on creating alternative sources of supply. And this is exactly what my good colleague, Dr. John Kent, will talk to you about now. Dr. Kent?
Thank you, Dr. Dobrkowski. Let's, I just had my, there we go. I'm going to take control, I think. Yep. And then go to the next one. As others have done, I want to do the same and thank everyone for Dean Waller for inviting me and others to present today. It's an honor to present in the honors symposium on the pandemic. My role today is to talk about a temporary supply chain to help address the stress that has been placed on the traditional med-surg, as Dr. Dobrkowski mentioned, supply chains. And so I have put together a few slides to help guide my comments. The first one is a call to action. I look at what our team has done with this temporary supply chain almost as a volunteer opportunity. If you think about any time that there's an emergency, a natural disaster, I don't want to say Americans, but just people, I think in general, want to help. And so how can they help? And I was added to an organization called the Bush China Foundation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the reason I was added to that coronavirus action network was because of the demand that Dr. Dobrkowski just talked about, and we talked about LinkedIn articles and Walton Insights. Dean Waller did a few minutes ago. This slide that you see on the screen now is a slide that was produced for one of the Walton Insights articles, and it does a few things for us. It shows the demand and how it's much greater for 5 specific PPE or personal protective equipment products. And by the way, I had never heard the acronym PPE before this pandemic. I don't remember what was the first day that I heard it and had to look it up and figure out what it was. But now I think we all have a much greater idea. But here are 5 examples of specific products that our temporary supply chain is helping hospitals to place orders for. So you see the N95 masks, the face shields, the viral swabs, the insulation gowns, and then surgical masks. So when we use the term mask, there are multiple levels of quality of each of these kinds of masks, and I'm not going to get into all that detail. I had no clue about any of this 8 weeks ago. But this was the call to action. Was the demand was exceedingly high. The traditional supply chains were not able to meet that demand. And one other thing that's a concept, or one other concept, excuse me, that we use in supply chain management is safety stock. So safety stock is that stock that you keep to deal with variation in your supply chain. And when there's a pandemic, the variation went off the charts for demand. And I'll talk a little bit more about that safety stock in a few minutes. So when I started, I didn't press start on my timer. So now I'm pressing start, so I'm gaining a couple of minutes. Hopefully not. Okay, so the organization, again, this is a temporary organization. It did not exist 9 weeks ago. The first day of spring break is when we started putting this together. As you can see on the slide, there are 4 primary components, but there's certainly many other components to the organization. It started with the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, a colleague of mine in Northwest Arkansas is the president of the Arkansas Asian Business Association, and she is also a board member for the China Bush Foundation. And she knew that I was a faculty member with emphasis in supply chain management. But not only that, she knew I focused on China. And so she asked that I would, if I would agree to be added to a WeChat group, social media group to help. Again, it's called the Coronavirus Action Network, and it's a group managed by the Bush China Foundation. So then that brought in the Walton College supply chain department via me. David and I have been working most closely, but others as well. And then you see an organization there called Lamason Consulting. Lamason Consulting is owned by a gentleman that I met a couple of years ago in Shanghai. And he and I have just had more of a personal relationship, no business interaction until now. And actually, he and I had a 45-minute call already this morning, like we do very frequently the past several weeks. So Lamason Consulting has helped us to provide a trusted person on the ground in China to help us identify the Guangxi Vista International Trade Company, which those of you that may get involved in international trade will understand the importance of having a trading company to help manage the finances, the money flow, help do several things. So that's the primary organization. The WeChat group had identified over 20 suppliers that I was in. And I started seeing all these suppliers come up, and I decided, hey, it's spring break. I have a little bit extra time. Maybe I can help get some organization around this. And the first day of our organizational meeting was just the Walton College, just myself and the Bush Foundation. And they were all excited that we were getting ready to start taking all of these text messages that have been coming into the group for a month. And so I said, well, maybe we can get, a set of, I used the number five wide body air freight planes and have them land in the hot spots around the country. And we have these 20 suppliers, and you've already told me about them. And so they're great to go. So we left that first meeting on a high note with these things we needed to do. I sent an email to my colleagues. They may remember in the department, it was on Monday of spring break, and then David replied back. And the next day we have another call, and on the second call we find out that 0 of those suppliers have been qualified, and that is one of the most risky parts of this supply chain we were trying to put together. And so I went from being, on this high of, hey, we're getting ready to do the Jared Kushner, air bridge, FedEx, free air freight, we'll get all this together, to a low the very next day of none of these suppliers have been qualified, and oh no, what are we going to do now? That's the most risky part of it. Hadn't been done yet. So that's when I sent a WeChat text to my friend Keith Lamason. Keith's a Marine, been living in China for 25 years, been doing this kind of work in a different industry, and David joined as well. And so he knew hospitals and med surg, and we started talking with them. And an important point here is, right in the beginning of this process, people were asking, well, why don't you just let the professionals do it? What are you guys getting involved for? You're going to be competing with each other. We don't need you here. And we agreed, well, if we don't need it, then let's not do it. But the hospitals and the med surg suppliers were telling us, please help the safety stock that we have relied on for this emergency. We found out is depleted down to 28% of the national reserves for PPE. So that means our safety stock was depleted 78% when we started the pandemic. If we had all of that, we wouldn't be having I probably wouldn't be part of this meeting right now, this seminar now, because we wouldn't have necessarily needed a temporary organization. We went out, and I won't talk much about it, but supplemental funding, as we were about 2 weeks into it, and David and I had a call with Dean Waller on a Thursday afternoon saying, we think we're getting out over our skis, Dean Waller. We have this organization set up, and 3 hospitals are ready to send over $1 million. They have to pay this in advance, and we're a volunteer organization. Can we get some money to help these people get paid? And so I won't go any further into that, but that was part of the temporary process. As of today, there are over 100 people that this small 4-person group started with that are connected. There are banks that are doing wire transfer that are on our emails. And so it's a very big, I shouldn't say very big, but it's grown a lot, the number of people that are coordinating to make this happen. And so we began on March 23rd. I don't know when the ending of temporary is. I thought it would have already passed by now. I don't know when the end will be. I'll just leave it at that. Now, let me go to a picture's worth 1,000, maybe 10,000, maybe 1 million PPE. There are lots of PPE products there. So what you see on the screen now is, as you see, it's labeled, is a warehouse, a customs warehouse at the Pudong Airport in Shanghai. And if you do the quick math, that's 35 cargo flights a day, and that's just Shanghai. There are Hong Kong has more. Shenzhen, Guangzhou both have many, and it's. I have another slide in a minute that'll talk a little bit more about how to describe what's happening. But I am very happy to say that none of the products that we are working on in our temporary supply chain are in that room right there. I would hate to know that our products were in there and we were trying to get them shipped out. Just synchronizing that Dr. Thomas mentioned earlier is what we're trying to do, and we're out of sync. There are planes that are leaving the airport half full because they can't get all of this full warehouse project sorted out, because the airline pilots' time is getting ready to run out and they have to take off, and we don't have it full yet. So I think I'm out of time and I started my time relay. The high risk, we all know about the politics. That is not helpful right now in what we're trying to do. I understand it's part of it. The U.S. and China customs are both changing the rules all the time. and we started, and the rules have changed. You have to pay everything in advance. They're counterfeit products. I talked about the depleted. The hospitals are unsure. Air freight is quadrupled since January, and it's doubled in the time we've been working. A little bit about our milestones. The good news is there are products that have already landed in spring or been delivered to a hospital, Mercy Hospital System distribution center in Springfield. There are many, many more, several 100,000 more products that haven't been delivered, but there are several, almost 100,000 that have been. We just had a ship dock in Los Angeles with another 175,000 shields the other day. What are we learning? Prices are peaking. We're starting to see some downward price in air freight and product, but we locked in when it was high. It's still very high, by the way. Second bullet here, it's a roller coaster. Targets are moving and shaking. Certainly not for the faint of heart. I think the temporary supply chain project will end when we get our safety stocks up to levels that the traditional supply chains can manage them. Sorry for overrunning my time.
Thank you, John. And now we have risk management and blockchain that will be covered by Mary Lashley and Remco Van Hoek.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, John. Exciting, engaging, and generously in the middle of the action as always. So a great example of how you and the team are personally helping cope with some of the risk outfall in the supply chain. And what I wanted to do is to build upon that by going into risk management in the supply chain a little bit further, and then tee up that blockchain can be another way to cope with some of the risk challenges that we are facing. So let me frame risk management in the supply chain a little bit, because what we're experiencing are a lot of consequences of that. First point is there are different types of risks: environmental, supply. So you've heard an example of shortage of supply. Demand risks, that's the fluctuations in demand that drove some of the empty shelves that you saw in the photo. Process risks, so some of our supply chain processes may not be able to cope with some of the risks. And financial risks. Key point, second bullet, is that those risks are not created equal. So some risks are a cause, others are more of a consequence. So COVID-19, for all intents and purposes, would be categorized as an environmental risk. It is something that hit our supply chains from the outside. And as a consequence, it drove some of the supply and demand risks. Secondly, is there are primary and secondary risks. So the supply and demand risks that we faced led to some process risks and ultimately drove financial risks. So a shortfall in supply drove control processes into a challenge and caused loss of revenue in the end as a financial risk. So they're not created equal. The good news is, third bullet, that there are several typical risk responses that we know of that might help mitigate and cope with these risks. And you've heard some of these already. You can decide to temporarily build up some extra inventory so that you can cope with extra demand or reduce the risk of supply shortfalls. You can ensure that you have multiple sources and multiple suppliers that you can turn to. And you can step up your information sharing throughout the supply chain so that we all can be more prepared for challenges that we might face. So what I wanted to do is to share with you across 2 pages a couple of things that we've learned from the work that we've done for and with companies during this period, and take you to a little bit of a roadmap for how companies might approach managing risk in response to COVID-19. So 5 observations first. The first is the various types of risks are experienced differently depending upon what part of the supply chain you look at. So retailers
have been coping a lot with the demand risks, the sudden peaks and changes in demand that are hard to stop for. Manufacturers have been coping a lot with the supply risks. I'm not getting my supplies out of China. And logistics companies have been facing both. During the initial demand surges, there were shortages in transportation capacity. Now there are some reductions on the demand side, which cause a new repositioning. While there are approaches that you can consider, there's no standard playbook for risk management. So different risks call for different responses, and different situations, such as the one we're in, need to be approached with a very customized approach, depending upon where in the supply chain you sit and how the supply chain is structured. Some risk approaches can help in the short term. So buffering inventory or moving orders over from one supplier to the other, those are really great things that you can do to mitigate the impact of risk in the short term. But for the long run, it may not be sufficient. Other risk techniques may not be doable in the short term. So when we say, well, it's important to develop new sources of supply and to get new suppliers on board, that takes a little bit of time. You cannot do that just overnight. And that leads to one of the main points, is that in coping with the risk consequences of the COVID pandemic, some of the hardest work in supply chain is still ahead. A lot of focus today has been on mitigating and recovering from short to mid-term effects. But the longer-term effort to structurally de-risk the supply chain is going to take a longer period of time and cannot be done within a period of weeks or months. And what will be key is that we do not lose sight of that as we begin to recover, because if we do, we might face in the future a situation of needing to relearn some of the lessons. Little side note, as a researcher, I'm excited to see the tremendous flurry of research activity and calls for papers for research on this field. And I think that is one of the small, modest ways where we as researchers can make a modest societal contribution in this time. So I'm excited to do this research, and I'm even more excited that lots of colleagues are all over the opportunity to help build a roadmap for coping with the risk. And our initial version and thought about that is on this page. So a complex page to give you some pointers and some direction. Let me orient you to it. On the far left, you see that we're going into risks throughout the supply chain. So you see supply, manufacturing, demand, and information. So it is throughout the various parts of the supply chain that have been touched upon. And that second column offers some of the risk management techniques. Some of them I've referenced already that are typically suggested that can be considered here. And so at the very top, in manufacturing, it is commonly suggested, well, make sure that you don't become too reliant on just a few or single factories. That's what happened to HP, for example, who for their European PC supply chain had rationalized all of their manufacturing into just 2 factories, all located in the Wuhan area in China. So their complete supply chain for PCs headed for Europe completely shut down for a long period, because they have essentially consolidated into too few factories and too few locations. So the suggestion is ensure that you have multiple sources and locations and suppliers, and make sure that you're not solely dependent upon just a few global sources, but ensure that you have some near and local sourcing options too. Nike has been on that path for some time, whereas they combine sourcing from global consolidated factories with a degree of sourcing from near shore and local suppliers to be able to respond to changes in demand faster and be less dependent upon just a few factories. In the demand and information section, inventory buffering is what I mentioned, is a commonly suggested approach. And there's a lot of suggestions around information management. If we drive for more active sharing of information across the supply chain, we can improve visibility into demand, into inventory, and potential supply problems throughout the supply chain so that we can all be better informed and hopefully be more proactive. On the supply side, obviously suppliers have a key role to play, and so collaborating with the most important suppliers to focus on ensuring supply in risk scenarios is a key commonly used suggestion. And facing financial risks, suppliers can be a source of negotiating some concessions to cope with supply risks. The next three columns offer initial thoughts about a roadmap for coping with the COVID-19 pandemic risks in the supply chain, from short-term mitigation to midterm recovery to longer-term recovery. So most supply chain managers today have been spending most of their time in those first two, the short-term mitigation and the midterm recovery. And the longer-term recovery efforts are predominantly things that are still to be done, which leads us to the statement that the hardest work may still be ahead. So taking you through short-term mitigation actions at the very top, the opportunity to shift orders between suppliers, plants, and geographies is one that, for example, Nike was able to do because they had multiple sources in place. So if one region is no longer able to ship, maybe we can step up, manufacturing in another one. Equipment manufacturer said that actually, because of the tariff situation with China, they had been focused for some months on building up new sources in India and elsewhere in Asia. And they were able to actually leverage that capability to, when China shut down, move some of their orders to India and elsewhere in Asia. And then when India and elsewhere in Asia started shutting down, China started opening back up to move some of that over. So that's an approach of shifting orders between suppliers, plants, and geographies as a short-term mitigation. In the information and demand side, in addition to seeing what you can do on buffering inventory, really active information management and sharing of information is what you can do in the short term. Where is there still some supply that we could dip into? Which supplier is still able to ship? And can we reposition some of our inventory so that we reduce the risk of running short? On the supply side at the bottom, the short-term mitigation with suppliers typically is working very closely with critical suppliers to try to establish priority in shipments that are able to come, and focusing on ensuring that critical supplies come to us first if we can. So this is very much a benefit if you have a good collaboration in place, if you know your suppliers well, if you are well qualified as a customer of choice, you might get just a little bit of priority, which might pay off in terms of short-term mitigation. You can build upon that in the midterm too. Can you collaborate with your suppliers to jointly navigate a way out of the crisis? There's a little bit of risk in response to financial risk to seek short-term concessions from suppliers. Markets are down, you need us to help. And there's a huge risk in that, whereas that may be a source of coping, could also potentially threaten years spent on developing collaborative relationships by turning opportunistic and seeking concessions. So caution on that side. Over on the longer term, there are lots of things that are barely only starting and where we have a lot of work to do in the period ahead. If we're saying it makes sense to ensure that you have multiple supplies and multiple sources, what you can do in the midterm is accelerate work that you may have in place, but to find new suppliers, to develop new manufacturing locations, to set up operations in new countries, that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it cannot be done overnight. So that example of Nike, they were lucky because they had some work already done, which they could accelerate, but that had been a multiple year journey. So there is a lot of work that can be done here to basically de-risk our supply chain structurally. Same thing on the supply side at the very bottom. This is an opportunity to grow collaboration with critical suppliers and to make sure that supply is not only about will the box arrive and will we not pay too much, but that we're also focused on how can we structurally de-risk our supply chains. And then in the center there are lots of process improvements that we can put in place that will be a little bit harder than shifting an order from one supplier to the other. Inventory will actually end up reducing as a result of it. So whereas in the short term it may be good to raise inventory, in the longer term, if we start improving our processes, we'll probably see inventory reduce as a consequence of process resilience. And then finally in the center there, in the technology space, there are lots of things we can do to consider newer technologies and newer technological capability to help us improve visibility and transparency and reduce the risk profile of our supply chain. And we feel that blockchain technology can be one of those. And we hope that that's an area where we will continue to see progress and innovation to de-risk the supply chain. And that's the segue to you, Mary. You can take it from here.
Okay, I do feel confident taking control of the slides, Dean Waller, so I've done that. Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Van Hoek. He's really set up this idea of risks in supply chains. And I just want to pause for a second in our deliberations and really kind of elevate this to the idea of systemic risks in globalization in general. So this slide has a very provocative title. It says COVID-19 as one example of a butterfly defect. And where I got that title from was a book I read in 2014 by Oxford University professors, and they were trying to make sense of the global financial crisis. And really the idea of their book is because we have globalization, which brings tons of economic and advantage and opportunities, it also brings systemic risk. And so things that, happen locally swiftly manifest itself globally. So the global financial crisis is an example. COVID-19 is an example. Global warming is an example. The rise of xenophobia is an example. So we live in a globalized world with all of this systemic risk. The title butterfly defect really comes from a play on words. So I think in your third session, you all learned about exponential equations, which comes from like chaos theory. And it's the idea that a small change locally can produce a big perpetration, globally. And so that's what we see with butterfly defects. So you start to feel overwhelmed as a human being, and many students may feel this way. Oh my goodness, things happen over in Wuhan, China, and now I'm stuck in my home. And so there is a downside, but this is going to be a very hopeful presentation because the opposite also can occur. We can be a positive force locally, and that positive force can also expand globally. So hang in there. We'll end up with a positive message here. So one of the things that these authors said was, we don't want to get away from globalization. Going to strong nationalism isn't the answer because we do get benefits from globalization. But what we need to do is manage this systemic risk. And how we do that is with sharing data and sharing governance. So we've already heard that theme across several of the speakers already in supply chain about the collaboration and the cooperation among partners in an ecosystem. And so I'm an information systems professor, so I'm just going to share one set of technologies that can help us with the data sharing and the data governance. And that technology is blockchains. So we talk about products moving through supply chains, but it's also data about those products that move through supply chains. And data itself can be conceived of an asset. So just think about what's going on with trying to figure out globally what's happening with the number of infections we have, the test results we have, the number of hospitalizations. That data is gathered locally and then has to be shared across national borders. We know that there's not a lot of trust with data sharing when we have centralized institutions in charge. So one of the things that blockchain technologies are very good at is they have some distinctive capabilities where we share data and we share governance about that data, and we don't put one institution or one government in charge. We're already seeing things like blockchain technologies being used to do things like prevent fake news. So you have a source of a news article, and how do you protect the source of that news article as it gets disseminated through a network? So these technologies that we call blockchain, they have properties of they're distributed, so they're not centrally controlled. They have properties of immutability that once data is verified and added to a blockchain system, nobody can tamper with it. So we can trust the data that we're all making decisions from. And it really allows for transparency, which is why you have an information systems professor talking with a bunch of supply chain folks, because blockchain technologies are very well suited to provide end-to-end visibility for authorized parties through supply chains. And so I'm going to give you some examples of blockchain technologies that are already helping in supply chains in general, and then we'll pivot and talk about some that are helping with COVID-19. So we have some pretty pictures here, and we have end-to-end traceability for our food supply, so that we like to term tracing our food from farm to fork. And we already have blockchain applications in production like the IBM Food Trust. And Walmart really helped develop and work with IBM and an ecosystem of partners to make that application a live reality. And the idea is you're in a Walmart store and there's a food recall for romaine lettuce. Before blockchain technologies, every piece of romaine lettuce has to be pulled off the shelves. And after blockchain technologies, you'd be able to trace it trace the contaminated food back to the source of the farmer. So it eliminates food waste. We can help improve food quality assurance. We do that with bait to plate, so making sure that food is caught in an ethical way, and the seafood that ends up on your plate. Bumblebee Foods is an example with a supply chain enabled solution. We have a beef to butcher with Beef Chain out of Wyoming. We also do it not just for food, but for other things like ethically sort diamonds. So you don't want to buy a blood diamond. So we have like blockchain solutions like Everledger that will trace the diamond from the mine to the diamond on your finger. Okay, so now I'm going to pivot and talk about some blockchain solutions for supply chains that are directly affecting the COVID-19 virus. So Professor Kent has already talked about how he's working with supply chains for personal protective equipment. And I'm going to share with you somebody who's a good friend of the Blockchain Center of Excellence. You see his picture here. This is Colonel James Regener, and he retired from the Air Force. And he retired about 5 years ago. And one of the things that really frustrated him as an Air Force pilot is sometimes his planes couldn't take off. He's on an aircraft carrier in the middle of an ocean because he's got a bad part. Can you imagine a supply chain trying to fly, how much you would disrupt your supply chains and you're running critical missions? And he said, this is absurd. Why don't we 3D print parts where we need them, when we need them? And he's been working with Moog Aircraft and launched a company called Veritex. So this technology has been under development for a long time. Just like Professor Kent, Colonel Regener with the COVID-19 said, I want to help. What can I do? And he realized that the Veritex technology he'd been developed can be redeployed to help do some things for equipment for the COVID-19. So he launched a new company called Rapid Medical Parts, and he launched it in March 2020 of this year. So that should say March 2020, by the way. And he got a contract with the Department of Defense in just 12 days. But here was his brilliant idea. We are short of ventilators. Go back to the March news cycle. That's all we talked about. We need ventilators. We need ventilators. We have a shortage of ventilators, but we have an abundance of sleep apnea machines. And he figured out that with a few extra printed parts, he could convert a sleep apnea machine to a hospital grade ventilator at a fraction of the cost. So that's a great example of, and it's using blockchain technologies to make sure that the instructions for printing are tamper proof. So hopefully what we've talked about in this short time together is globalization creates systemic risks, and we've given some examples of supply chains. But in times of crisis, we also have great opportunities for innovation and for people to become a butterfly effect. People like Professor Kent, people like the Colonel, who said, I may just be one small person, but I can do actions locally that can also have exponential impacts and do something positive to help address this. So with that, I will turn it over to the dean to present our next speaker. I'm sorry, I don't remember who's up next.
Okay.
So, Matt, I believe I have it.
You do. Thank you.
Okay, great. Once we switch to the next slide, there we go. So, thank you, Mary. I'm always fascinated by your insights. I think you're also a butterfly effect. So, keep doing great work. And I'm also honored to be here. And with the few minutes that I have to talk about COVID-19's implication on the food supply chain, really, I want to focus on, to Mary's point, what the pandemic has revealed as underlying issues that exist in the food supply chain. And so to help us better understand the food supply chain, I first want to talk about the supply chain for none other than the famous toilet paper that we're all aware of. Toilet paper has brought to light an underlying phenomenon that supply chain managers are tasked to deal with every day. And that's what we refer to as the bullwhip effect. If you had a chance to read the article that was posted for you, Little Wiggles Make Big Wiggles, you'll recall that any changes in the demand at the consumer end of the supply chain or those little wiggles causes massive, chaotic, and hard to manage fluctuations in inventory and production throughout the rest of the supply chain, or those big wiggles. And the best way to reduce the bullwhip effect is for the whole supply chain to cohesively respond together to those little wiggles, to those shifts in demand. If consumer demand increases or decreases, you want the rest of the supply chain to match that very, very quickly, to be responsive. As David and Rod said, balance or synchronize the supply chain to that shifting demand. And so that's what's happened in the toilet paper supply chain. Out of fear, we all ran to the stores. We cleaned out the shelves of the toilet paper and hoarded it in our garages. But the reality is that the toilet paper supply chain actually responded quite quickly, in my opinion, relative to other supply chains. So there were big increases that were sent to the manufacturing plants. And while the trucks had to wait a little bit, the toilet paper plants were able to ramp up production really quickly and start replenishing the shelves. If you go into Walmart, Sam's, wherever, you'll see plenty of toilet paper. And so now let's compare this to the food supply chain. So the food supply chain, put simply, is far less responsive to changes in consumer demands. And that's really for two underlying issues. First is that growing plants and animals is a process that can't be upscaled or downscaled very quickly based on consumer demands. And, taking soybeans, for example, the picture I have there, the plants would take about 3 to 5 months from seed to harvest. So that means that it would take a supply chain around a half a year to respond to a sudden shift in demand. And most other foods also suffer very long lead times at the farm end of the supply chain. So very different than a lot of the other products we purchase, which creates all kinds of challenges. And so looking at the long lead times, it has an implication for the second challenge that we face in the food supply chains, and that's that we have independent, separate supply chains throughout the food supply chain, and so we have distinct types of supply chains. So here's a simplified version of a food supply chain, and moving from the right side to the left side, you have the consumer, who buys food from either the food or the beverage services, such as restaurants, that top box there, or institutional buyers, such as K through 12 schools, hotels, etc. And that's the first really grouping of supply chains. And the other is below that is for consumers who buy at the supermarkets or the retail stores, which you see there in red. And what the pandemic has done is it's shifted demand from what was mainly in the first group, food and beverages, institutional buyers, to retail stores. and which has a different type of supply chain that we got to deal with. And the food banks I won't talk about. That's a whole nother fun issue that we can get into later. So just to walk through a few quick examples, first is about 50% of fresh food, fresh produce is sold through restaurants, hotels, and schools. So when the pandemic shut down those channels, farmers who had already harvested their crops were left with either rotting food or flash freezing the produce, which is a financial loss for the farmer. The next is eggs. So while demand for eggs initially spiked, about 30% of eggs produced in the U.S. are liquidized to restaurants, schools, and hotels. And so the pandemic shut down a bunch of liquidizing plants and impacted the farmers supplying those plants. We saw a similar thing with milk, creating problems for farmers after the shift. And so then the other really interesting example is meat, which is most of the food and beverage industry, where cattle at feedlots are sold to meatpacking plants to be slaughtered and then cut up and then shipped off to the different channels. And similar to the other examples, at this processing part of the supply chain, the middle of your screen, is where the challenge comes in. So different producers cater to different consumers, and it's really difficult for them to switch their supply chains on a dime. And so what's especially challenging in the meat industry is that the cut-up operation people are typically shoulder to shoulder, and social distancing is really, really tough in that area. And whenever you try to spread those out, you end up really slowing down input. So overall, COVID-19 has made the processing at the bottleneck in the food supply chain. So it's made the processing part the bottleneck of the supply chain. And so our challenge is, how do we alleviate that bottleneck? And the way that we've got to do that and focus on is making our supply chains more responsive. The answer is not, like many are saying, to hold more inventory, in my opinion, because most food is perishable. It actually makes us less responsive and agile, and it's simply not sustainable in terms of cost in the long term. Instead, I think we've got to find a way to create the ability to increase capacity quickly through problem solving, innovation, and lean thinking. And we also need improved technology such as robotics at the cut-up operations. Right now, that's really, really difficult to pull off given the variance in products in meats that go through the line. But we need innovation there, and we need to improve that. We also need to improve processes to be able to switch over lines quickly. So adaptive distribution, packaging, labeling, and we need to work on the regulations that allow us to do that as well. So now, lastly, it's important to recognize that if once we come back more and restaurants open up and schools go back, we'll see a lot of the challenges and that bottleneck alleviated. But again, we really want to look at this as seeing that underlying issues that this has revealed, and how do we improve the supply chain for the long term. So, with that, with that, I want to turn it over to Brent, who's going to help us figure out, help us think, how do we become more agile?
All right, thank you, Brian. I appreciate you handing it over to me, and like the others, I'm happy to be here. My name is Brent Williams. I'm a professor in supply chain management and one of the associate deans in the Walton College of Business. And I want to pivot our conversation just a touch and really talk about the pandemic and its influence, and maybe even a framework for how we might lead and manage differently because of what we've experienced. The words that you see here are probably a compilation of many of the words that you've seen over and over throughout this honors forum. And I'll just highlight a couple of those that really stand out to me that I think connect to this topic. You know, if you think of, we've heard change so many times, the way that COVID-19 has changed our businesses, our supply chain, even us to a degree. We've heard uncertainty, and we certainly have heard disruption. I mean, this pandemic is certainly a worldwide disruption. So what does that mean to me as a leader and a manager? And how might I operate differently? How do I need to operate differently, possibly? And here's what we're going to talk about Agile and a little bit of the way that we in the Walton College are implementing an Agile way of managing. But maybe before I do that, I should, what am I comparing that to? And so I'm just going to use the word a traditional management style, which is really a broad and maybe even vague term, but you can imagine me as a leader, if I need to maybe implement something, change something, one way that I could go about doing that is I could define what I want to happen. I could define a timeline that I want it to happen in. So, for example, this implementation or this change, new product possibly even, I could define that I would like to have this in 6 months or 3 months. I could set up a project plan to get there. I could bring a team together and ask them to do these sets of tasks and check in with me on maybe a weekly or a monthly basis. And so that's one way to manage. And quite honestly, it's effective in many, many senses. But in a period where you have such uncertainty, and I would say, you know, the pandemic has really created not only uncertainty, ambiguity, and complexity. I think that approach can be challenging at times. And so we've pivoted to Agile in many ways, and I'm currently leading multiple Agile teams. So when you think about Agile, it's really it's a term that was popularized in software development, and the way that we can think of it, it's a collaborative, adaptive approach to software development, but that translates, I think, to many other aspects of the business. And we're seeing that not just in the Walton College, of course, we're seeing many large enterprises start to take that concept and implement it as a management style and a way of working within traditional business functions, human resources, HR, supply chain. So what does this look like? And in our short time, I'm going to boil it down to a few simple points, one of which I think is fairly philosophical, and two are very operational. And you know, that first one, in this philosophical approach of solving stakeholders' problems and being very intent about that, I think is the core to this methodology. So focusing on your stakeholders. Now, just for us in the Walton College of Business, you can think about, we have many stakeholders, but really in this pandemic, we have focused intently on two, and that is our students and our faculty. And as a leadership team and as a group, how do we sense the problems that this pandemic has caused for them, and how do we help create solutions and help them create solutions? And so that's core to the methodology, solving problems. You know, second has been how we operate. And, you know, so if you think about what I talked about in a more traditional approach, which would be maybe I set a 3 or 6 month time frame, and I kind of lay out from the beginning how I want this project to go. Now I'm thinking in much, much shorter increments. So in fact, we're working in 2-week sprints, meaning that each week we're defining what we're going to work on. And then we'll assess at the end of that 2-week sprint the progress that we made and what maybe in the environment changed around us. And how do we need to adapt in the next 2 weeks? And so it's a much more adaptable way of working. And then finally, using Scrum meetings or Scrum calls. For us, we're doing virtual meetings that are 15 minutes. And this is where a cross-functional team that comes together and really does two things. And that's reporting on progress and identifying roadblocks. And then that team collectively helps to knock down any of those roadblocks that exist. This way of working also does something else that's really interesting, and it's creating accountability actually on a daily basis. So if you think about those three aspects of the way we're working and the way we've pivoted to Agile, I think those are three of the most important ones. And you see benefits. You see information being shared quickly. You see this intent focus on problem solving. And then one, for me at least, really unintended benefit that I didn't necessarily expect has been connection. So in a time where we're physically disconnected, this way of working has created more connection in the team than, quite honestly, than I've ever seen before. There's a quote by a gentleman named Steve Denning in a 2016 Forbes article, and I cited this in the article that you were sent. And I love this. I love these two sentences when it talks about Agile. He says that Agile enables organizations to master continuous change, and it permits firms to flourish in a world that is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I love that because I think this period of time, wow, that really sums it up, right? Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And this approach has at least allowed me and many on our team to manage this in what I think is a more effective way. And then finally, I'll conclude with this idea of a mindset. And I think for the way I think about leadership and management, and it's evolved certainly, and it's particularly evolved over the last couple of years, Agile is just it's in some ways a tool that enables this overall product mindset. And, I have in the slide a photo of the Macmillan Innovation Studio. And this is really where from the Samuel Walton College of Business's standpoint, we're able to influence how students are working, what they're learning in the studio, and it's starting to proliferate throughout, I would say, the college and the university. How do you think with an innovation or a product mindset? And there's just I want to identify 5 elements to that that we think about when we think about an innovation or a product mindset that are really important. And you'll notice that it starts with that user customer focus. So how do you focus on your user, your customer, what their problems are, and importantly, how do you empathize with those needs? And then second, how do you prototype and experiment fast? And I think, particularly in a period of time that is so complex, there's uncertainty like we haven't seen before. Testing ideas quickly and inexpensively is critically important. You have to be open. You have to give autonomy to the teams. Those teams have to have end-to-end ownership. So from the problem formulation to the end implementation. And finally, data. You have to get data-driven insights that can lead you to faster, better decisions. So Matt, with that, I'll turn it on to you. And I think you'll build on the leadership concept.
Thank you, Brent. One thing I would like to add here, we're using Agile in many parts of the college. We actually run marketing using an Agile methodology, for example. So it's a big part of what we do. Since we have about 10 minutes left, I would like to open it up to the students for Q&A.
Okie dokie. All right. We had a lot of great questions. By the way, that was a wonderful presentation from all of you. I learned a whole lot, super important, not just for this current crisis, but I think moving forward. And you certainly convinced me of the beauty of supply chain management.